Good morning, everybody. If you could please take your seat, we'll start. Well, that was very quick. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us at this forum looking at the City of Perth Inquiry Report and the lessons learned. My name's Jamie Parry and I'm the State President of Local Government Professionals WA at this particular time. I'd firstly like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered here today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to formally acknowledge our speakers today, the Minister for Local Government, Heritage, Culture and the Arts, the Honourable David Templeman, MLA, who will be joining us by video shortly, and Mr Neil Douglas, partner of McLeod's Barristers and Solicitors. Well, I trust most of you have or are making your way through this significant tome. I read the other day that inquiries are the confessions of governments of the inadequacy of normal institutions to cope with extraordinary situations. And the City of Perth report is certainly extraordinary. And given the publicity surrounding the inquiry, the findings, I think, come as very little surprise with regard to the city's failure to provide good government and what needs to be remedied to ensure sound governance into the future. But while we have these governance themes and legislative structures, just one thing to scrutinise, the issues around culture and behaviours of both elected members and officers is another thing. And I think this report, when you read through it, you shake your head because it's so salacious, disheartening and disconcerting all at the same time. When the Minister first made an announcement about receiving the report, he made the comment that many of the failings that were identified within the City of Perth inquiry report were also considered to be common to many other local governments. And as such, the findings had the potential for much broader sector-wide application. And given that inquiries seem to have become a growth industry in WA during the past few years, I was really disappointed by that comment at first. But then on reflection, I didn't take it as a criticism of the sector as a whole, nor failure to acknowledge the many local governments that include officers and elected members that really have committed to good governance practices, but that the statement was one that was reflective of the significant problems that were currently facing us and the future of the sector. And for those who read Paul Murray's piece in the paper yesterday, I only add that, well, local government in reform in WA has only been discussed for more than 15 years or so. It's becoming quite tiresome, and we appear to be no closer to addressing those fundamental governance issues and engaging constructively with each other and the state government about the required transformation of the sector. So I asked that when will we have the legislation that is flexible enough to allow local governments to be able to effectively respond to the different challenges that we all face? Where is the much needed scrutiny and early intervention of the Department of Local Government to deal with these issues? Who's taking responsibility for the capacity building capabilities of the sector, and who is actively leading and supporting the sector to strengthen our governance practices, stamp out those poor behaviours and hold people accountable? And while I think we're probably not all facing the same issues that the City of Perth did, there's a growing number of examples where governance failures are affecting our industry, and as such there are certainly lessons for us all within this report. And I do encourage you, if nothing else, to use these findings and recommendations of the City of Perth report to undertake a comprehensive governance health check of your own local government. And if there are opportunities to improve, either make them or seek assistance and guidance from your fellow members. We don't share enough of our information and treat it like it's intellectual property. Reach out to people who are your fellow members. We're all here to help each other and to strengthen our sector. So our association in particular will continue to advocate for changes in legislation, better governance structures and principles, but we're also focused on looking at how we can improve the perceived professionalism of both elected members, CEOs and senior staff. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the Minister talk about this particular report. I've been with him yesterday at Wolga and the day before at the State Local Government Partnership meeting. And these matters were something I think were of interest to everyone around the table. And also really looking forward to Neil's perspective on the report, given his experience within the sector and what we can do collectively and individually to improve our sector and regain that community trust, which has strengthened so much during COVID. So thank you for listening to me for that brief introduction. The Minister is going to be joining us, I think, at about 7:50. Until then, please enjoy the breakfast you are about to be served. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your breakfast. Good morning, Minister.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce the Minister for Local Government, Heritage, Culture and the Arts, the Honourable David Templeman MLA, who is obviously joining us by video, and that's because he does have an immediate engagement following his address today. In any case, we're very pleased that he has been kind enough to accept our invitation and be with us on short notice. As delegates will know, the Minister has always had a deep interest in local communities and that he's lived in. In 1994, was elected to the City of Mandurah Council and served the council for 7 years, the last 4 as Deputy Mayor, before his election to the State Parliament in 2001. And in 2017, he was sworn in as the Minister for Local Government, Heritage, the Culture and the Arts. And it's certainly a great time to be a local government minister, and I must say that during these COVID-19 times, the Minister has been a great advocate and supporter of local government and engaged with local government professionals extremely well on matters affecting the sector, and I do thank him in that regard for his efforts. So if you would please welcome the Minister.
Kaya, and welcome from Mandurah, which of course is where I am from now. And can I acknowledge, first of all, the Noongar Whadjuk people and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land in which you're meeting this morning. And for me, I acknowledge the Binjarra people as the traditional owners of the land in which I meet this morning and join you in Mandurah, Western Australia. So if you're wandering out yonder, please come down to Mandurah. We'd love to see you at some stage. Can I acknowledge Tony Power, the inquiry panel inquirer? Can I acknowledge the City of Perth Commissioners who are with you this morning? Andrew Hammond, Chair, Gay McMath, Deputy Chair, and Len Kosovar, the Commissioner. Can I acknowledge Interim Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Murray Jorgensen, who's with you? Jamie Parry, of course, President of LG Pro. Candy Chu, CEO of Local Government Professionals. Duncan Ord, who's joining you, I understand, this morning as well, the Director General. To all of you, no matter which council or indeed which section of the sector you are here representing, it's great to join you this morning. Look, first of all, I just want to thank very quickly the Local Government Professionals Australia for inviting me to be part of this industry workshop this morning. It's a very timely opportunity, of course, given the handing down of the City of Perth inquiry by Mr. Tony Power. Can I also acknowledge and thank Tony Power for his work and those men and women that worked tirelessly with regard to the impanel inquiry. And I also just want to acknowledge the City of Perth Commissioners, the Commissioners and the late, of course, we had a Commissioner previously that was appointed and unfortunately he passed, but to the Commissioners in Andrew, Gay and Lynn, can I acknowledge your work in ensuring that the City of Perth's administration was steered back onto track, and I'm very hopeful and confident that come the 17th of October this year, when of course we will have democratic elections for those positions on the City of Perth, including the Lord Mayor's position, that we will return the City of Perth to not only a democratically elected institution, but of course that it will once again be able to function as it should for the people of Perth and indeed for the businesses and visitors that come to the City of Perth. The capital city of Perth is very much a special local government in Western Australia. It holds special judicial status, of course, with its own legislation. And when we came to office in March 2017, we were keen to establish a mutually beneficial relationship with that council and with, of course, the local government sector. Unfortunately, though, that was not the case with the City of Perth, and I'm saddened by that. The City Council was characterised by, unfortunately, catastrophic dysfunction. And there were reports that on several occasions, individuals had repeatedly put self-interest before their statutory role and their service to the community. The issues, though, were not limited to the council itself. The administration was also failing. Morale, sadly, was poor. There were claims of bullying, and essentially the situation had become untenable. And so I formed the view at that time that if I did not intervene, then I was failing in my responsibilities as minister to that community, to the businesses, and to the ratepayers and residents of the City of Perth. So the first step in finding solutions to the City of Perth was to define the problem. And on the 2nd of March, I initiated, of course, an inquiry into the City of Perth under Section 8.19 of the Local Government Act. Now, these are rare. We don't have panel inquiries. They are rare. And so I want to make that point. But the situation had become so serious that this action, in my view, was essential. The inquiry was tasked with determining a number of key issues. The first was whether there had been a failure to provide for the good government of the community. Secondly, the prospect of good government being provided in the future. And thirdly, what steps were needed to secure the outcomes sought. Now, last month, as you are all aware, 2.5 years later, I tabled the City of Perth inquiry report into the Parliament of Western Australia. Now, the City of Perth panel inquiry report paints a picture, a sad picture, of poor leadership with rampant factionalism, dysfunction, poor governance, and interference in administration. There was a culture of self-interest, a lack of accountability and transparency. And my decision to suspend the council has undoubtedly been justified. The report contains, though, and this is the important aspect for me and I hope for all of the sector, some very important learnings. And it should be noted that whilst we have 138 local governments in the state, and there is only a handful under investigation, and not all local governments and local governments shouldn't feel tainted by a report into the City of Perth or other, but there are very important learnings to come from this report and others, and it's an opportunity to look at some feedback. I just want to turn very briefly to the main points of the City of Perth inquiry. That the primary finding of the inquiry itself is that there was gross failure to provide good governance at the City of Perth between October of 2015 through to March 2018. Those failings were most acute in the period between October 2017 and March 2018, when the city's dysfunction became untenable. Minimum performance standards and service benchmarks attributed to and expected of the Capital City Council had all but collapsed and were replaced by the city's new norms. Norms that directly or indirectly served personal interests instead of the collective interests of the capital city. That is the City of Perth, whom they should have been serving. The report very clearly reveals the implications of what can happen when governance breaks down, council members overreach their responsibilities and interfere in the administration. The report also found that there was significant dysfunction in the administration as well as in the council. To determine the true extent of the city's dysfunction across the council and the administration, the inquiry panel conducted a number of case studies. Now, findings from these case studies, which are robust in their investigation, exposed beyond any doubt the city's poor governance practices, underpinned by negative culture and systemic organisational deficiencies. It's these important findings that will help inform, in my view, the key lessons learnt from the inquiry itself. I just want to take a moment to step through the case study findings with you. Firstly, in regards to administration, the report found clearly that the administration demonstrated poor governance practices across a range of areas, including strategy and leadership. The report also found strategy and leadership failings in organisational and people management, financial management, and planning management. The administration also demonstrated poor governance practices across its core business areas. Most notably, these included strategic planning, including limited development of the city's potential capacity, and procurement and contracting, which included the failure to declare and manage conflicts of interest, and the failure to monitor contract costs and enforce budget limits, and poor governance processes and practices, including limited oversight and limited fraud and misconduct risk assessments. Without a strategic focus, a positive culture, and effective engagement, the administration's efforts to achieve good governance practice as the day-to-day norm can never be anything more than an empty aspirational statement. If I can now turn to the council. The council's poor governance practices included a range of grave concerns. Firstly, the lack of transparent decision-making. And the case studies highlight, for example, decisions relating to planning matters not being based on planning considerations. A lack of accountability. For example, case studies showing excessive and unacceptable uses of the dining room, for example, for family and friends. The lack of disclosure of personal interests and entitlements. In fact, the report found that most councillors, in fact, failed to disclose their financial interests. There was inappropriate focus on specific events for the allocation of grants for sponsorships and for ticketing or tickets. And there was an activation of a crisis management plan in the closing days leading up to my suspension of the City of Perth Council. As Minister, it's particularly disappointing to find that the Council's governance failures began at the very heart of the democratic process, the electoral process. And these situations included, as examples, the use of sham leases to become eligible to stand for election, or to provide a candidate with corporate nominees who could vote for them. The making of false complaints to the city in order to have legitimate corporate nominees struck from the electoral roll, and controlling post office boxes, giving rise to the suspicion that there was an intention by the candidate to falsify votes. These issues are compounded by the report's finding that the city appeared to be unable, firstly, to identify and, importantly, to remedy these significant failings. Manipulation of the electoral process is a dagger to democracy and subverts the inalienable rights of all electors, not just those within the city of Perth. Sadly, this negative culture, left unchecked, undermined the confidence in the city of Perth and, by association, the local government community. But I'm aware that even where local government administrations succeed in implementing good governance practices, if a council wants to ignore these, good governance outcomes will be compromised. On the whole, the report found the city's failings, both singularly and collectively, provided for fertile ground for greed, incompetence, and sadly mismanagement to flourish. Now, unfortunately, other recent inquiries into a number of local governments, both metropolitan and country, have shown that the city of Perth is not the only local government with culture and governance issues that need to be addressed. And part of the response to this report includes amending legislation to put the relationship between elected members and the administration beyond doubt. And this reform process has already addressed a number of the issues that have been raised in the report. For example, we now have a mandated training regime for elected members, a mandatory code of conduct for members and candidates, and provision of clarity for elected members to manage real and perceived conflicts of interest related to gifts. The report's recommendations are significant, and those recommendations related to the local government sector are broadly supported by the McGowan government. And these, together with the recommendations of the Local Government Act Review Panel released recently, will feed into the Local Government Act review process. So if I can conclude, today the City of Perth and the broader local government community has a unique role to play in helping our state work through the destructive impacts and the ongoing challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to pause here and recognise and acknowledge that when tested in the COVID-19 experience, local government overwhelmingly has responded well, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate the efforts of all involved in the sector in their response, individually and collectively, and acknowledge that as an important aspect and role of local government in Western Australia. Now, as the City of Perth works through its corporate recovery plan, I am confident that it will succeed in recovering the confidence of its own community and the wider West Australian community. I'm equally confident that good governance practices will be progressively restored across the city's council and administration. And again, I acknowledge the work of Mr. Jorgensen as the interim CEO and the commissioners in their critical role in that aspect. And as Minister for Local Government, I am looking forward to the city achieving its full potential as a modern, innovative capital city local government. It is so important, not only for our sector, but for our state, that our city local council becomes a leading council. I'm hopeful that a reimagined and repurposed City of Perth, together with the state's local government sector and the state government, will form a strong partnership that will generate post-COVID-19 transformational opportunities, not only, of course, for our local government, but for our entire state and neighbours. And can I highlight that? The rest of the world has been watching very closely Australia during this COVID-19 experience. There is particular interest in Western Australia, not only because I think our state, through the Premier and a cooperation of the wider community, has been so successful in keeping us safe. But the rest of the world, in a whole range of areas, will have an enhanced focus on Western Australia post-COVID. That is an opportunity for all of us to not only prepare our communities, be they regional communities or other, for what I think will be an intense interest in Australia and Western Australia in particular. We need to be ready. The city of Perth needs to be ready when we welcome people from around the world back when our borders come down in the future. It's very important that our city shines when those people seek to visit us and when people seek to, of course, reinstate connections physically. In closing, I'm sure you'll agree that there are very significant lessons to be learned from the City of Perth Panel Inquiry Report. I think it will help all of us to do better, to empower the men and women within local government councils across the state and administrations to work together for the benefit of their communities, to be focused always on the people that they serve and they seek to advocate for and represent. Can I thank all of you again for the opportunity this morning, and I hope and am sure that your discussions will continue, but let's learn from this important lesson that's been handed down through the City of Perth report. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Minister. Yep, thank you very much for that, and we as local government professionals look forward to working with you on improving governance structures throughout local government in Western Australia. Do you have time to take any questions? Or?
I'm very happy to. Okay,
well, for those who are online, if you could text through any questions, and this will relate to Neil as well, to 0409 138 807. That's 0409 138 807. Now, we'll have a roving microphone, I'm sure. So does anybody have a question that they would like to ask the Minister while you've got the opportunity? No? Okay, well, I've got one.
Oh, good.
The report and also the panel report as well has a growing number of recommendations in relation to local government oversight that are the responsibility of the Department of Local Government to progress. And I think we all acknowledge the current lack of resourcing of the department. So what's the state government strategy and commitment to greater capacity building capabilities by the Department of Local Government, and someone who's going to be able to assist us in leading the change that's required?
Look, there are some of the recommendations in the City of Perth report do highlight the enhanced important role of the local government or department itself. Can I assure you that Duncan Orders, our Director General, who's with you this morning, has been working very hard to ensure that we increase the capacity of the department, because it is important that the support of the department is there to not only assist in the carriage forward of a number of the important recommendations, but also, of course, in assisting in the ultimate drafting and guiding of a green paper, which will see a new Local Government Act developed over time and be introduced into next, or be part of a priority for next year, the next term of government. So I can assure you that all is being done, and obviously resource issues. We have the state budget coming up in October, and resource issues in terms of ensuring that the department is adequately resourced are certainly given a priority by me.
Thank you, Minister. Now we do have a question online. Candy?
Good morning, Minister. I've got a question here from Raj from the Shire of Three Spring. What is the timeline for the new Local Government Act, Minister?
Well, first of all, hello to Three Springs. I know Three Springs very well. I lived there for 3 years. Great place. The timeline is obviously COVID. We're in a process of reviewing the Local Government Act. Unfortunately, of course, COVID paused that significantly. We have had, obviously, an extensive consultation period process with phase 1 and 2. We've had the panel report feed into that, and of course now the City of Perth report. The intention is to finesse the policy levers with regard to the sector and the local government act. We are intending to work through that into the next term of government, presenting ultimately a green paper. Now, the very nature of a green paper means extensive consultation will be part of that process. So into the next term of government, I would expect or the intention is to have a green paper ready in that first half of that new government for a new act that comprises inputs from a range of important milestones.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Oh.
Thank you, Minister, for that talk and for Jamie.
Could perhaps
I'm
introduce yourself, Louis, and the local government you're from?
Louis Hitchcock, City of Melville. My question is, will the government ever consider external oversight for the dismissal of CEOs? And by external oversight, I'm talking outside of the particular local government that is seeking to dismiss a CEO.
Thank you for the question. As the City of Perth report has highlighted, there is and has been, and there are clear examples in the City of Perth report, where delineation of responsibilities have been blurred, and of course they've led to some significant problems. That's one of the issues in the City of Perth report. The issues around CEO recruitment, there are some recommendations that have been made in terms of the panel, the expert panel. I'd ask you to have a look at some of those, and we're inviting feedback. Essentially, our system, though, has the clear delineation with regard to a CEO being the employer of the staff, ultimately, the council, and the employers of the CEO, of course, are ultimately determined by the council itself. We would be looking at, in the light of the City of Perth report, the panel inquiry, the robustness of the current system. Any changes to that would need to be ultimately justified and enshrined in legislation.
Thank you. Candy, you have another question?
Probably last one before we're going to move on. Mike Cole from Fig Park. What is the timing for the new mandatory code of conduct?
Sorry, I just missed that last bit.
What is the timing for the new mandatory code of conduct?
We're working very hard on that. I'm very keen to get that. I think that's almost been finalised. It's very important we get that code of conduct, the mandated code of conduct in place ASAP. Candy, I'm expecting that to be imminent.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Minister. We are going to have to move on with the breakfast. So if you could give the Minister a round of applause and for thanking him for coming today.
Thanks very much. Nice to join you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Neil Douglas, partner of McLeod's Barristers and Solicitors. And Neil is well known to us all, and for over 40 years he's acted for federal, state and local governments. He's been a partner of McLeod's lawyers for more than 13 years and was previously a partner at Minter Ellison. Neil's been commissioned by the state government to head a number of public inquiries, including those into governance issues at the City of Coburn and into governance and clinical operations at King Edward Memorial Hospital. He's also served as Acting Commissioner of the Corruption and Crime Commission for 3 years, between 2012 and 2015. We all know that Neil's words are those that are well considered and worthy of attention, and I look forward to hearing how Neil is able to deliver this tale with the poise and calmness he is well known for, or perhaps today will be a little different. Welcome, Neil.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jamie, for your generous and humorous opening. And also thank you to Candy and Viola and the team for organising today's session. I also acknowledge the Noongar Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land where we meet this morning, and offer my respect to elders past and present. As the Minister mentioned, this inquiry, the panel inquiry that's just been completed, is fairly rare in terms of local government. Only a handful have been held since the Local Government Act came into force over 24 years ago now. That in itself, you'd expect, would be sufficient to attract the attention of the public, and particularly those in the local government sector. But in this case, there's a number of other factors that increase that attention. One is that before this inquiry was initiated by the Minister 2.5 years ago, there'd been a great deal of media attention on the City of Perth, largely focused on the Lord Mayor and her declarations or non-declarations of interests and gifts, and all the issues surrounding that, including going to the State Administrative Tribunal and the Court of Appeal. Another factor is that during the course of the inquiry that has just been completed, there was continuing media attention, not only on what you'd expect, that the evidence that came out in the inquiry and the public hearings, but also on the decisions and actions of the city's commissioners and the interim or caretaker CEO, Murray Jorgensen, during that time, in implementing fairly radical organisational change of the city, considering the problems that had been identified at that point. Two other contextual factors that were touched on by the Minister. One is the extensive amendments to the Local Government Act that were made in late 2019, some of which still haven't been implemented. And a lot of those changes relate very much to matters that were the subject of the incidents considered in the inquiry and its recommendations. And also the final report earlier this year of the Local Government Review Panel, described as being the most significant and comprehensive reform of local government legislation conducted in more than 2 decades. In this morning's really brief review of the inquiry report, I propose to focus on the broader issues and themes, particularly in the context of the current legislative reform program. Hopefully we'll have a time for questions at the end, where some of the more detailed issues may be the subject of questions. In terms of the key events, the inquiry panel was appointed on the 24th of April 2018. That was about 7 weeks after the Minister had suspended the Council. As with previous, in fact all previous panel inquiries, it was preceded by a departmental inquiry. That departmental inquiry was initiated to inquire into matters arising from a letter from the CEO at the time at the City of Perth, Martin Mileman, to the department about gifts received by elected members in the form of tickets to numerous events, resulting in potential breaches of the financial interest provisions. Now, as some of you in the room will know, the City of Perth wasn't the only local government subject to that authorised personal inquiry in early 2018. A lot was overtaken by the City of Perth, and the other local governments involved seemed to escape the attention that might otherwise have got because of that. Shortly after the authorised person inquiry, that's the departmental inquiry, was established, its role was expanded to cover much broader issues, not just gifts. And one of the catalysts for that extension was a letter sent by Martin Milam to the Director General of the department. Now that was on the 12th of February 2018, so a month after the authorised person inquiry, but just a couple of weeks before the council was actually dismissed. That letter from the CEO was co-signed by each of the 5 directors, and it was set out in some detail some of the concerns that the CEO and directors had at that time about what was happening at the city. One of the things it did was referred to legal advice that it obtained about the interactions and communications between council members, and particularly between council members and administration, that impacted on the city's functioning and particularly impacted on the health and safety of the workplace. It outlined a series of measures that the administration had tried to take to improve the conduct of council members and the way that the council operated. And then it stated that the CEO and the directors had formed an opinion that certain elements of dysfunction had become apparent. There were 5 examples of that dysfunction. They were the attempts by council members to become involved in administrative matters, including directing staff, the significant volume and repetitive, argumentative and disrespectful communications from individual councillors directed to CEO and senior staff, the political or biased approach to council debate and decisions, including decisions in relation to senior appointments, the fractious relations between individual councillors and the office of Lord Mayor, leading to additional administrative workloads in dealing with the city's business. And it expressed the view that the current authorised inquiry, that's the departmental one, would be or may be an appropriate mechanism to deal with it. The Director General got on board, and the same day he indicated that he would undertake an immediate assessment and would respond shortly. That departmental inquiry ceased operating shortly afterwards when the Minister announced that the council was going to be suspended and that there'd be a panel inquiry set up. There were some interesting aspects to the way that letter was dealt with by the inquiry panel, and if we have time I'll come back to that later. Another key aspect of this timeline is, as the Minister mentioned in his opening earlier today, the council elections in October 2017. Now, following those elections, the Lord Mayor no longer had a majority on the council. The City of Perth by no means the only local government where the problems occur after an elected mayor or president loses a majority partway through a term. And not only loses a majority, but where that lack of support then degenerates into fractious relationships between council members, and that in turn leads to problems in dealing with the administration, affecting the functioning not just of the administration but the organisation as a whole, and of course the capacity of that local government to provide services to the community. As you can see from the timeline, most of the last 2.5 years has been involved, the City of Perth's been involved with inquiries, either with the initial one or the inquiry panel. The inquiry report, those of you, I'm sure many of you have looked at it. It comprises 4 volumes. It's a very extensive one. Volume 1 sets out typically the processes and procedures and the way it goes about it. Volume 2 is the case studies that the Minister referred to today. That's a very extensive 800 or 900 page volume, setting out the details of particular investigations into particular incidents and issues. Volume 3 is probably the one that most of you would want to go to from the start if you want to avoid the long review of the inquiry. That sets out the conclusions and recommendations. And Volume 4 is another very large one dealing with the appendices. They were mostly reports commissioned by the City of Perth itself and by the inquiry. Some of those reports are particularly useful in terms of going back and having learnings from the situation at the city. The inquiry report obviously reflects, as it does the inquiry itself, the very significant investment of time, funds and other resources in conducting a public inquiry of this type. It's easy to lose sight, outside the system of what the cost is, both financially and otherwise, within the local government that's being subject to that type of inquiry. Whether it's worthwhile depends on what lessons can be learnt and what improvements can be made, and particularly what action is taken as a result. Not just within the City of Perth, and you'd expect that, but the industry as a whole. Now, typically after all these inquiries, there's been a lot of very promising statements made about what will happen. If you reflect back on some years later, some of those ambitious comments haven't borne any fruit. And so what it's important this morning to go through and you all go through as a sector to see what can be done, identifying what improvements can be made, but then keep an eye on, and those of you who are able, try to influence what can be done in terms of action. Inquiries typically run this course. They look at what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how to fix it. In the case of the City of Perth, while the focus was on the particular issues at the city, it made it clear from the start, the inquiry made it clear, that its investigation was undertaken in the broader context by reference to local governments generally and in the reform process, even looking at local governments and what was happening in other states. And that's particularly the case when you look at the recommendations of the report. In terms of what went wrong, the primary finding, as the Minister mentioned, was that in that period that the inquiry was looking at, between October 2015 and March 2018, there was gross failure to provide good government to the city. That failure was the direct result of poor governance and decision-making at many levels, lack of integrity and teamwork in the city's leadership, and widespread cultural and systemic failings in both the council and the administration. The inquiry concluded that when the council was suspended on the 2nd of March 2018, the situation had deteriorated to the point where neither the council nor the administration had the capacity to provide good government into the foreseeable future. The inquiry report then looks at and separates the failures of the council and the failures of the administration. The first of the identified council failures, and there's 4 of those on the screen, is local government elections. And these were mentioned by the Minister. The broad conclusion of the inquiry report was that the election processes were undermined by improper manipulation. So there were sham leases, corporate nominee processes were falsified to entitle people to vote who wouldn't otherwise be eligible. There were these false complaints made to the city to have legitimate nominees struck out. And one candidate used his family's post office boxes at the postal address for voters, raising a suspicion that the candidate intended to falsify votes. From the administration's point of view, the inquiry report spent some time dealing with the city's processes and how the CEO and those employees within the city responsible for overseeing elections, to a point of course, because they're overseen more broadly by the Electoral Commissioner, how they measure up to their task, and its conclusion was that they failed to adequately deal with issues of electoral manipulation. My observations of that at this point is that it's apparent that the inquiry report sets high standards for the CEO and local government employees for their role in relation to local government elections. Not much attention was given, it seems, to the role of the electoral commissioner. And that is an important factor, both legally and practically. There have been many situations, and you would be aware of it more than me, where the administration staff has expressed concerns about aspects of the electoral process. For example, in eligibility claims, they've been refused, it's gone to the electoral commissioner and they've ticked it off, so they've allowed the appeal. So those aspects really need to be considered in a broader focus of the electoral system. The issue with sham leases has been around for decades. It's not just an issue at the city. At the city, broom cupboards have been used to qualify candidates back in the 90s, and I'm sure Gary Hunt would be able to tell us about what happened earlier than that and what other issues. And it's not just metropolitan local governments. Local governments all around the state have had issues about these sort of sham, in the broader sense, qualifications for electors and the way they've made use of leasing. Now, there's been no legislative change. This has been on the table for decades. It can be easily fixed. It can be fixed legislative and making it a genuine lease. So that's an example where we can come back years later and many times focus on this, but in our system we know that it can be fixed in a particular way and it can be fixed easily. Now, that's the Minister's responsibility in terms of putting this to Parliament and Parliament coming up with a solution that will fix that problem. Decision making is the second category identified in the inquiry report. And the report concluded that the evidence indicated that some decisions made by the council, particularly relating to properties within the city's district, either didn't reflect the interests of the community or were affected by personal interests being put ahead of community interests. And the two examples that it gives in its conclusions, one concerns a development application which says appears to have been refused by some council members, not on any proper planning basis, but on the expectation that it would be overturned on appeal in SAT and that those involved would be more likely to vote for the council members who opposed it. The other involved a decision to reject a sponsorship proposal in circumstances where it was initially supported by council members, but then when two local businessmen objected to the process, the council eventually rejected it as well and didn't give reasons. Neither of those are obviously appropriate decision making, but again, they're decisions that those in local government wouldn't see as unsurprising. It's certainly not limited to the City of Perth, either in the planning context or in a broader context. In conflicts of interest, the report emphasised the importance of properly dealing with conflicts of interest and identified situations where some council members had failed to disclose their financial interests, and some had made use of entitlements, including the council dining room and reimbursement for costs for dry cleaning and restaurants and so on, which they weren't entitled to, or they used for their personal purposes rather than their official purposes. Apart from references to the council dining room, again, these situations are not uncommon in local government, well beyond the City of Perth. In relation to grants and sponsorships, and there's a particular focus of the city because the City of Perth allocates millions of dollars a year in this, so that's at a much higher level than other local governments, but many local governments, in fact most, get involved to some extent in community grants and allocation of funds. At the city, the risks identified by the inquiry report were that some council members received gifts, including tickets to events they didn't properly deal with, and more broadly that some council members attempted to ensure that the city allocated money to organisations and events which they had a personal connection. Now, I expect if the inquiry had been looking at the City of Melville, there's a recent assessment where the mayor and some council members who had a very strong affiliation with the Melville Bowling Club and took their own approach in relation to a proposed lease instead of the administration's recommendation for a 20-year lease. They approved what would in effect a 100-year lease for an organisation that they had this personal interest with. It again would have seen that as being not good governance. So they're the failures that the categories of failures that the inquiry identified in relation to the council. In relation to the administration, the inquiry identifies 4 as well, but the first 2 of these were essentially, when you look at the report more closely, essentially failures of the council or council members. In relation to the CEO appointment and termination process, the inquiry found that the city's termination, or the council's termination of the CEO's employment, that was the original CEO in this period, Gary Stevenson, that there weren't proper processes followed, either in relation to the termination or in relation to performance reviews. And similarly, it found that in relation to Martin Milam, his appointment processes, both acting CEO and CEO, weren't transparent and capable of review. The inquiry suspected, and one of its findings was that it did not find that the Lord Mayor orchestrated the termination of the CEO's appointment because he had reported to the CCC some travel and accommodation contributions she had received but not declared. Now, although there was no formal finding implicating the CEO, that does raise a much broader issue of the CEO's role, which again is addressed in the report, about this difficult role the CEO has of being the enforcer. So under the CCC, under the legislation affecting the Corruption and Crime Commission, the CEO is required to report suspected misconduct to the CCC. There's no discretion. But there's a whole variety of circumstances in the regulatory framework where the CEO is the internal enforcer of roles and responsibilities and of poor behaviour. And that puts the CEO in a very difficult position where the CEO's employment is dependent on the confidence of the council, the very people that the CEO is saying no to. People management was another category identified as an administration failure. And part of this was involvement of some council members in the recruitment and termination processes for certain staff. This has been going on, council members wanting to become involved in personnel matters ever since the Act came into force. And it's still an issue, and again it's an issue where the CEO intervenes, and the CEO either intervenes and says you can't do it, or allows it to happen and creates problems for the local government and for the CEO's successor. Under this category, there are also findings by the inquiry about inappropriate use of deeds of mutual separation. So this wasn't involving the council, but where within the organisation, employees who were leaving the city were given termination payments and deeds of separation in circumstances where, in the inquiry's view, dismissal may have been warranted instead. Financial management and planning was a broad issue, and it's particularly significant for the city with such, with its finances. It has over $200 million a year in operating revenue, and about 70 million is generated from its parking business unit. So issues of finances, and particularly systems, became very significant. And the inquiry highlights a number of deficiencies in the systems and processes used at the city. Procurement and contracting, again, another area that's where there are clear deficiencies across the sector. The inquiry looked at 5 specific procurement exercises conducted by the city and concluded that in each of those there were some failings, some worse than others, in the way that they were conducted. Now, each of the failures identified, those 8 categories from the council and the administration, they clearly warrant serious attention, and there's some very good learnings in the report, both in the conclusions but in the case studies about what can be done to improve the situation. But simply from reading the report, it's not readily apparent how those failures, even collectively, resulted in the city becoming dysfunctional, in the sense of actions being taken or decisions being made that affected the ability of the local government, the city in that case, to provide services to the community and to properly serve the community. It's in an earlier section of the report that there's more clues given as to how the situation evolved to the point where it became dysfunctional. And these are the factors in the report which are said to be contributing to the city becoming dysfunctional. The first of these, the council was factionalised, particularly following the elections in October 2017. So we're only talking 5 months before the problems really occurred and the inquiries were launched, where the Lord Mayor lost a majority, and the divisions in council became worse and led to the deterioration that I mentioned. Another group of factors was essentially poor behaviour by council members. And poor behaviour is essentially either or both not respecting roles and responsibilities, or all the way council members behaved in terms of the sort of code of conduct issues that we're all familiar with. Being respectful in communications, not making offensive or objectionable comments about staff and others, doing their job properly. So that's the second category of factors. The other factors that are attributed to the administration that led to the city becoming dysfunctional, as set out in the inquiry report. One was that the CEO was unable to prevent council members interfering in administrative matters. Another was the lack of harmony and cooperation developed within the executive leadership group at the city. Now, one thing I was curious to explore in the report but doesn't really answer is to what extent the council's problems, the bickering within the council, the communications between council members and the administration led to that lack of harmony within the executive leadership group. Mind you, that lack of harmony wasn't evident in this letter signed by all the members of the ELT and the CEO in February 2018, urging the Director General to do something about the problems of the city. Other factors contributing to the city becoming dysfunctional were some complaints and allegations not being properly dealt with, and some procurements not being properly handled. Now, those list of failures and factors attributed to the city becoming dysfunctional don't address a matter that's to me, is becoming more prevalent from what I see in local government, and that's the practice of, as I've mentioned, of some council members inundating the CEO and senior employees with large volumes of communications, typically argumentative, belligerent, and demanding immediate attention. In circumstances where the cumulative effect of those communications has a profound effect on the functioning of an organisation. In cases that I'm aware of, senior staff can spend, instead of spending 10% of their time dealing with these sort of communications, they can spend by far the majority, 70 or 80% of their time dealing just with communications from elected members. And these communications aren't communications just asking for information about a matter that's becoming before the council. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about matters where council members, in a situation where they're in great conflict between themselves, involve the administration in it to get the ammunition either to fight each other or the administration. And unfortunately, this is becoming a more typical in some local governments. Now, another factor arising from this is this issue of the health and safety of the workplace. And again, this is an issue that's been sidetracked. the LG professionals did some really good work in commissioning University of Western Australia last year to do some research on this, and many of you will be aware of the results of those, which pointed out a really serious problem in relation to that. And one of the problems from the government's point of view is that agencies have ducked responsibility. WorkSafe Commission has this practice, which it won't confirm, but the way it operates in terms of particular issues being raised before it, it won't deal with complaints where the CEO is involved, where the CEO is the person who's being bullied or being inundated with these communications or being subject to other issues that result in an unsafe workplace. So the mechanisms are there to deal with these within government, but they're not being dealt with. And unfortunately, I think this is not one of the issues that wasn't dealt with in the report. And it's not clear why, but it seems to have been sidetracked. Some of the communications, which I thought were dreadful, were described in the report as being spirited exchanges. So perhaps it's a different perspective on the way these things are viewed. An example of how this was dealt with at the inquiry was that letter that I mentioned earlier of the 12th of February was the only document produced by council assisting at the opening of the inquiry 7 months after it started in November 2018. So this was the only document. Now, council assisting didn't deal with any of the 5 issues of the dysfunction that were identified by the CEO and the ELG. The only point of raising the letter and giving it to the press, or the media, which reported widely on it, was to support council assisting's submission that what the CEO and the ELG did in that case was at odds with the local government statutory framework for the administration to have a role of oversight and regulation over the council. It does seem to be pretty curious that during the course of an authorised inquiry, a CEO writes to the Director General and says, listen, we're having these problems and these are the problems, can you do something about it? That's considered to be interfering or assuming a role of oversight for the council. Fortunately, that submission wasn't adopted by the inquiry panel in its report, but neither was the more general issue about the communications from elected members and the problems resulting from it. The inquiry then looked at how to fix the problems it identified. Now, it approached this on the basis of a framework which is a very useful framework to adopt in terms of recommendations. One was that when you're looking at poor behaviour and poor decision making, what you need is rules, because rules govern how and they guide behaviour of how you deal with these situations. So there's 3 things about the rules that were highlighted. One is that you need, as far as you can, to have clear and simple rules. Secondly, the rules need to be properly understood. And thirdly, if the rules aren't followed, then there has to be sanctions. And that's a pretty simple model, and I think it's a good way to approach this very large inquiry and looking at the end about where do we go from here? So one's the rule making and things like the code of conduct, the comprehensive code of conduct and so on, and the changes to conflicts of interest. All those issues come under the rules. How they're understood is all about the training. And so many agencies now, and so much is being done in terms of talking anyway about training. And the third element is what to do about if something goes wrong. And that's the intervention aspect and the external support. So that's the way that this was approached broadly by the inquiry. It looked at these under these specific headings of systems and processes, and I'll just run through these briefly. Essentially, the systems and processes were focused on the city itself. Sorry, have I got a... We'll go back to conduct. Okay, the conduct issue was the single mandatory code of conduct. Now, we won't have time this morning, but there are much broader issues to be considered here. The idea of having a single mandatory code of conduct is in itself, we're proceeding down that track, so that's going to be determined. Some of the issues that were raised by the inquiry, though, need, I think, further consultation and consideration. The idea, for example, that we abolish or repeal all the provisions in the Local Government Act, the Local Government Administration Act, and the rules of conduct about financial interests, proximity interests and impartiality interests, and include them all in a code, in a simple proposition, principle-based, it sounds really good, but there are downsides to it. There's a lot of problems with the current system, the complexity and so on, but one of the advantages that it has is you can point, in some instances, to very clear rules about what you can and can't do, what's an interest and what's not. When you have a principles-based system, if everyone's working very well and they're all well-intentioned, that's fine. But the idea of persuading individual, particularly council members, that what they're doing is actually contrary to this principle, rather than a particular rule, is going to be much harder to implement. So there are issues about that code. Decision making, greater transparency and accountability, the improved practices for transparency, all these issues are ones that are important for local government, and we can all learn from them in terms of how to improve systems both in our own local government and more generally. Capability, that essentially deals with the training aspect, and this takes training to a whole new level, well beyond the reform agency's recommendations to date and what's been done to date in terms of induction training. So coaching, mentoring, the detail of it, including the assessment process that's been recommended. This is a major matter that needs to be considered, and again with training, as with the third element is the sanctions, it essentially is all about resourcing. I know a question was asked from the Minister today, but none of this will work unless there's effective resourcing. Systems and processes, finally got back to it now. This recommended operational changes to the city, including in the financial management area, that are useful for all local governments to refer to. The local government system changes, these were the legislative amendments and operational changes. There's changes proposed to elections, which again would address a problem that's been around for a long time, and to improve financial management. There are recommendations relating to, it's referred to as independent oversight of the recruitment and performance management of CEOs, but it's more about independent input into that in terms of making recommendations to the council. The council doesn't need to follow those recommendations, but it needs to have the recommendations, and then it needs to clearly articulate, and we've had that obligation before that hasn't been followed, but it needs to clearly articulate why it hasn't followed the recommendations. I'll move on. We want to allow time for questions, which is an important element of this workshop. So, one of the things in dealing with the way forward here is, I think, having a closer look at what happens when things go wrong. Now, there's a significant, although the report emphasises, and there's good reasons to emphasise, the common issues affecting both council members and employees, and the need to have, as far as you can, common rules affecting their behaviour. In terms of a lot of the aspects of a code of conduct are certainly are suitable to having a common, these common rules. There are significant differences, and this is almost the elephant in the room that people don't mention when we talk about recommendations and how to move forward. One's funding, but the other ones is that there are significant differences between the way council members get to be where they are and the way employees do. Within an organisation, the organisation itself has control over the recruitment, management and retention of employees. If something's going wrong, the organisation can do something about it. The organisation has no control about who gets on the council. And in itself, within its own processes, it's got very limited options about what it can do when things go wrong in terms of management, and no control over whether or not the person stays or not. So those basic facts are really important in determining how you move forward. So while it's important to have common rules and common processes, there are specific processes that are needed for council members as opposed to employees. Simply based on the situation that we have, this is the democratic process. Nobody's suggesting we change that, but things need to be done to accommodate that. And one of the key aspects I would suggest is in dealing with poor behaviour by council members, apart from training, which is vital, is early intervention. Now, to me, early intervention is the critical element here. Both within the organisation, and there are some things that can be done by the mayoral president, by the CEO, by other council members to address misbehaviour at the early stages in councils. But it comes to a point, and seems increasingly coming to a point, where those measures have a limited effectiveness. Then, for the case of council members, you have to rely on external assistance and involvement. And in the past, there have been instances, it's been the distant past now, where the department has been very effective in nipping these things in the bud. Now, those who have been around a long time, like me, would recall situations where that was done. There were people within the department at a high level who were prepared to get in and roll their sleeves up and go out and read the Riot Act to councils and council members to arrest some of these things early, and it didn't develop. So that's one aspect of the early intervention. Another aspect of intervention was the whole rationale for setting up the standards panel. Very quick decision making. When things go wrong, it gets reported. There's no investigation. You just look at the complaint, what the response is, and make a decision. Now, the objective there was to have a really quick response that was one element in this intervention. It's never worked. It's never achieved its objectives, largely because of time. And if you don't achieve the objectives, then of course there are calls to abandon it. Now, you can abandon it and have an alternative, as has been suggested in the report here. You have an inspectorate, or other reports have suggested a different sort of office. You can establish new structures, but in the end those structures aren't going to work unless the very objectives are able to be carried out. Now, they're able to be carried out when you get people who are ready, willing and able to do it, and when they've got the resources to do it. So it doesn't really matter, it seems to me, whether you have a standards panel that does its job properly, or you just abandon that and have another structure you propose to do the same sort of thing. Of course, there are other elements to it, but in terms of being able to deal effectively in an early stage with poor behaviour, that is a significant element that, and part of the reason perhaps why a lot of more major problems in local government get to that point, because they're not addressed earlier. Look, there are other aspects that I can cover, but I think that really addresses the key points that I was coming from the report and my observations of it. So it may be preferable, rather than me continuing on for another 10 minutes, to have questions from the floor. If we don't get any questions, then I'm happy to continue. Otherwise, we'll take the questions. Are you happy with that, Jamie?
Always happy with what you say, Neil. Thank you very much, Neil, for that address. And yet we are going to take questions. And as I mentioned, for those who are online, that telephone number, if you did miss it, was 0409 138 807. And we don't get the opportunity to have Neil in front of us talking about such an important report. So I'm sure many of you have lots and lots of questions. We've got one over here.
Thanks, Candy. Philip St John, City of Fremantle. Neil, you used the expression interference administration a few times. And I think all of us have been in a situation where you have elected members attempting to influence administration, should we say, to a greater or lesser degree. I guess the question that I'm struggling with and have struggled with, and I'm interested in your observations on, is, I guess, at what point that might become sort of improper. You know, there is, we've all been through situations where councillors attempt to influence administration. You know, they tell you their views on things, and they attempt to influence. But at what point should we try and sort of nip that in the bud when it starts then to become perhaps improper attempts to influence administration or to interfere? Because I think we've got increasing problems with, you know, well-educated councillors who have expertise in areas that we may deal with, and of course they see it very much as their role to kind of be the guardians perhaps of that sometimes. And I guess, yeah, drawing the line between their kind of legitimate right in the chamber as councillors to make decisions, but then attempts behind the scenes to influence officers.
Yeah. The job of the CEO is not easy, and we all recognise that. This is one of those judgment calls, and there is no, as you expect, there is no fixed line here. It so much depends on the circumstances, but I think many of us would recognise when that line has clearly been crossed. Now, some of the nuances here are that the CEO, of course, has a special relationship with the mayor or president, and they have a function of the act to liaise with each other about the administration of the local government's affairs. So you'd expect that during the course of that liaison there would be matters that arise where it might be seen as influencing their views being imparted. Now, that's for the CEO to deal with one-on-one. There's probably more latitude in that context for that sort of influencing that you're talking about to take place. I see that differently from communications, oral or face-to-face, by other council members with other members of the administration. And the more junior the person is, the more power imbalance there is, the more scope there is for undue influence. So there are some of the factors. More broadly too, we just can't look at this in terms of, you know, the major, more sophisticated organisations within the metro area, local government. In smaller local governments, inevitably there's going to be more interaction and more involvement between council members and the administration about what's going on. And more you see that covering the ground that wouldn't be covered in some of the larger organisations. So your question raises a lot of nuances. One thing that's important I think for any organisation is for the CEO, and supported by the senior employees, in fact all employees, to know clearly where the demarcation is in terms of not so much influence, but what the roles and responsibilities are. Now, so often over time you see almost bracket creep. Employees, CEOs for example, enabling council members to be involved in decision making. And then that continues along the continuum to a point where they expect that that's their right, this is the way we do things, this is the practice, we have a right to be involved in that decision making. Now at the City of Perth, it's probably more extreme, but the involvement of council members, particularly the Lord Mayor and Deputy Lord Mayor, in recruitment decisions at the city other than for the CEO. Now, you can see how CEOs over time have allowed that to happen, and then it creates a problem later on. So coming back to your question, I'm sorry it's long-winded. I think if you have clarity about what the roles and responsibilities are between the administration and the council, that will be a firm guide as to where that line is when it is crossed.
Neil, I've got quite a few questions here from the online audience, so I'll start with a couple of them. You mentioned about councillors, the universal training now for elected members, but although of course we all know that there's no consequences currently to not undertake those trainings. So the questions that I've got here is actually directed at the department, but I won't put you on the spot. Gordon, you here. But Neil, do you have a view on how the department should progress with this to really enforce and ensure that elected members do undertake the training and understanding of their roles and responsibilities?
Yeah, look, I didn't want to downplay that. I think training is a really important aspect. I guess the point I'm making, it's been recommended now for years, and with many inquiries, it's been recognised legislatively with the changes that were made in 2019, introducing induction training for council members. This has now been taken to a different level, enhanced training, there's coaching, and all of that is really important. But in terms of the effectiveness, one thing that the inquiry report does is talk about the need to assess the effectiveness of it. Now, I know it's early days in the terms of the training regime, but if those of you who have gone online to do the candidates, the council member candidates training, you don't really come away from that with a very good understanding of what your roles and responsibilities are. So, yes, it's a good start, but a lot more needs to be done on that. Now, of course, the easy thing is just have an online version you click and dealt with, and then government can almost tick a box and say we've done the training. I don't think that's the way it's going to work effectively. You've got to do a lot more about it. So to get involved more in the training, and along the lines that have been recommended, say in the inquiry report, considerable resources need to be put into this. You've got to have follow-up and feedback. There really needs to be an assessment to ensure there's understanding. A lot of thought needs to be put into the content of the training. So there's a long way to go on that, and I think that will reap a lot of dividends. It will stop a lot of this, at least the misunderstanding. The well-intentioned elected members who want to do the right thing, if they know what the right thing is, and that it's explained in the way that these recommendations proposed, that's terrific. That will go a long way towards addressing these problems. Of course, that's not going to be the only solution. Inevitably, we know there will always be those who, despite the training, will do the wrong thing. So there needs to be a system to deal with that.
Perhaps one more question from online, and then we'll come back out to the floor. So I've got a question from Dale Stewart from the Shire of Narrogin. So he's asking, it's not covered in the City of Perth report, but to what extent do you believe that popularly elected mayors, as opposed to those elected by their peers, is a key factor to causes disharmony or poor governance and leadership? And should we completely do away with popular elected mayors?
Yeah, my view is different from the popular view on this. I mean, people can talk about how great democracy is, and So the Americans can elect their judges. Great thing, democracy at work. But is it effective at the end? Now, in terms of electing a mayor or president, again, it's in legislation now, and we know it won't be retracted, but I don't think it's the best model. To have a good governing body, the leader of that governing body, the chair or president or whatever you call the person, has to have the support of that body. If it doesn't, if the person doesn't, it becomes very difficult. Now, a lot of the problems we've seen in local government arise because of that. That's the source. And particularly when you're elected for 4 years and there's midterm elections and you can lose your majority part way through. And time again in local governments we've seen that situation. If there wasn't elections of mayors and presidents, and depended on the support of the council, you'd have one of the sources for division and the problems that occur wouldn't be there. So my own personal view on that is we'd be better off without elections, but knowing that'll probably never happen.
I have a question here. Candy? I've got one here, so.
So Neil, I think it's me first. So Scott Hawkins from the City of Subiaco. This probably relates back to a comment that you made that's not actually covered in the report, but this idea of the council is the governing body, and then not an understanding in terms of the separations of roles and responsibilities coming through to the training that you were talking about, and training will only help if the parties involved actually will accept what the training is actually telling them. So if they don't accept the premise in the first place and don't agree with it, then they're not necessarily going to follow it. You were talking about the volume of email or communication coming from elected members. And I'm interested if there's a thought in terms of how this could be addressed and if there's legislative change that needs to come into play to help with this. Because you have the situation where you might be inundated with this communication from elected members, and if you push back as a CEO and say, no, this isn't required in relation to fulfilling your role, the elected members, if you've got a dysfunctional council, if they believe they got the numbers, can just basically take it to the council, put elected members' motion up, and then come back to address it. And as I understand it in terms of the role of the CEO, is then to implement the decisions of council. Yeah. So your thoughts in relation to that?
Yeah, just when these things happen, they're symptoms of something, a deeper malaise. And if it's not going to be this, it'll be something else. So that's why nipping it in the bud earlier is important. In terms of addressing the particular issue, even if the matter were to go to the council, at least that's a delay, 2 weeks or 4 weeks. Part of the problem with these communications is that the demand that I want instant attention. You know, my problem needs to be, you need to get back to me within the next half hour, and when you do, you've given me more information, so there's more questions I can ask about that, or more challenges I can make about it, and then I'll continue this. So actually having a pause there to allow you to get on with your work and serving the community, and saying, okay, if you want to take it to council, you can do it in 2 or 4 weeks, that might pause it. So there's some practical advantages of that, even though it's not ideal. It then becomes public, so I know there's disadvantages there. But going back to the actual practice, there's probably 2 elements. One is in health and safety issues. That constitutes bullying. I mean, depending on the nature of the communications, but this practice of repetitive, argumentative, belligerent, offensive type communications constitutes bullying. So if that was dealt with on a bullying issue by WorkSafe, and they're the external agency if it can't be dealt with internally, and we had some of those practices developing, if people knew that's what would happen to them and there was effective action taken there, then maybe the practice would lessen, if not cease. The other aspect of it is the code of conduct, and that's where, you know, I'm a strong supporter of having more principles-based legislation rather than volumes of detail. But one of the downsides of having principles is that it's easy for a reasonable person to say, look, what you're doing breaches these code of conduct in all these respects. It's not proper behaviour. And the other person looking at it says, prove me, show me where it says that. Show me where it says this email is a breach of the code of conduct. You struggle sometimes persuading them. And if they don't like your advice, they'll go to someone else, and they'll eventually might find someone who says something, you know, perhaps ringing up Wolga and putting a different version of events to them and getting a different answer, and then coming back to you and saying, oh no, Wolga says it's fine. We all know those things happen when things go wrong. So there are some mechanisms to fix it. Some need to be improved. But I just see that as a growing trend. I mean, if I look back 10 years, that was very rare. Now it's becoming more prevalent. And there's this bullishness now that elected members, we're talking about some here, we're talking about individuals, they're entitled to have their request for information dealt with immediately, regardless of what the organisation's priorities are, including the council's priorities. So I sympathise with the problem of not being a CEO. I can stand back from it.
Hi Neil, Liam from the town of Victoria Park. I wanted to query your views in relation to the report raises factionalism as one of the issues among councillors. I think increasingly in the sector, and I guess more broadly in community, if you have an organisation and there's elections, you might have two sides going up against each other, and that creates, you know, the bowls club has a faction, the student union will have a faction, and the councillors end up on teams or something similar. Is this something that the sector can really prevent or do anything against, or is it just something that's perhaps becoming more and more inevitable?
Yeah, look, that's really good to consider those sort of issues, because there are some things we're stuck with, and part of the democratic electoral process is we're going to get people elected, and they're going to have groupings. They're going to be like-minded. The more we can encourage council members to work as a team with the administration as part of the organisation, that we're all this one team, the less focus there is. But one or two individuals can really mess up that process. And that's all it takes often, at least at the start. So I don't see factionalism itself, you know, broadly in terms of having some like-minded people who tend to vote the same way on some issues. That in itself is not the problem. It's what arises from it and the extent to which it's taken. So, you know, we're maybe fortunate in some respects and unfortunate in others that party politics isn't part of our local government system, you know, largely here compared to some other states. But at least party politics has discipline that isn't here. It's like you're dealing with, you know, a lot of independents, and that has its own problems. So, yes, I think the rough heading, factionalism itself, isn't going to lead to bad governance or dysfunction. It's some of the implications from it.
I've got and we'll take one question here, and then there's one question down the back as well. I've got a question here from Bronte from the Shire of Capel. Neil, you mentioned about WorkSafe, and I certainly know that both yourself and myself have written to WorkSafe and the commissioners, and seems like that our letters just go into a black hole at some point. But certainly the WorkSafe Act is currently being reviewed now, and we provided our submission to the commissioners about the issues that we know about in local government. Do you think, or are you positive that any changes or actions are going to actually come out from the review of the Act itself in relation to the issues that we're talking about here today?
I don't think there's any need to change the Act. The Act makes it quite clear the employer is responsible for the health and safety of the workplace. The employer of an organisation is the city, town or shire. That's the employer. It's not the council. The council acts on behalf of that. Now, a CEO is an employee of the organisation. So the employee's rights under WorkSafe are the same rights whether you're the CEO, a director, a coordinator or anyone else. It's a very simple proposition. That's why I think it's never been challenged, although some of the investigators at WorkSafe will respond to a complaint saying, no, we can't deal with a matter that involves a CEO. when I've written to the Commissioner and got a response back that didn't actually address the issue and said, do you support this view? Do you view the Act as being one where a CEO is an employee and therefore entitled to the same rights? And there's no response back. So this is an issue, again, it's not about, I don't think it is about the law. No one's relying on the law to say CEOs aren't covered. They're relying on a practice that's been developed, and maybe there's some interests in it. People have got entrenched positions. So government can handle it pretty simply. And I think that's a growing issue for local governments. If that's by no means, none of these are silver bullets, but it's one aspect that may help in this area. To have an external agency come in for its specialisation, that is bullying, and to be able to say, yes, this is bullying, this is an improvement notice here, this is what you need to do about it. Whether it's more training or, some of the other sanctions it's got. So I don't see why local government should be out of that system.
Neil, there's quite a lot of mention, Linda Folan, by the way, yes. There's quite a lot of mention in the documents around culture, and we know that a lot of local governments are doing a lot of work to maintain their internal culture. But when the council imposes and causes dysfunction in the culture, it's very hard to coerce them into behaving appropriately and abiding by the agreements that are often put in place initially, but they just don't do it. So lots of time and money and effort is put into building these cultures, which get imposed by council. Is there any indication from the report that there's going to be something done to measure the culture that is imposed by councillors into the organisation? Because we measure organisational culture all the time, but how do we measure the impact of the behaviours of councillors into that?
One of the matters I skipped over briefly in the recommendations dealt with culture, and specifically the City of Perth, and it recommends that the city have this cultural assessment, and then it's reviewed. And one of the strengths of the inquiry report, it has follow-up on various aspects. Training is an important one, but follow-up in terms of culture as well. Assessing firstly what it is, then what can be done about it, and then having a formal assessment periods after that. And it has a timetable of follow-up. Culture is central to this, but in terms of doing something about it, it's largely affected very significantly by the rules you have in place. I'm not just talking about laws here, but policies as well, codes, and the unwritten practices. The idea that, they're the rules, but this is the way we do things here, that's culture. And so having clear rules generally, plus the training effectiveness, goes a long way towards saying that this is what the culture should be. And you'd expect that most people would accept that. But I think we have to go into this knowing inevitably there won't be. Some won't. And you can have a really good culture in an organisation but have one or two key individuals who can wreck it. And that's where I think we've got to look at those other factors and early intervention and so on. There's a sliding scale of intervention to address that issue, to allow that culture to be exercised and supported in the organisation.
Got one down on
Neil,
table 2.
Am I next?
You are.
Hi Neil, my name's Patrick Hall. I'm the Mayor of the City of Canning. I just wanted to, really interested in your position on decision making, and I picked up earlier you talked about decisions at Perth around planning particularly, and the issues around quasi-judicial decision making, and that's something that crops up. I think the issue that we have as councillors, and especially as mayors, is that we really, as a mayor, don't have any more authority, really, than any other elected member of council. So correcting behaviour for us, it can be incredibly difficult. And there's a premise at the moment that is thrown around liberally, adverse reflection, which no one seems to understand terribly well, and sends elected members often to the standards panel. We hold post-OCM, so every ordinary council meeting we hold a debriefing. I do with the CEO and also senior members of staff to talk about what went right, what went wrong, how can we improve what happened last night. If I tried to hold that meeting with elected members to talk about those same decisions, I would be no doubt accused of adversely reflecting on a decision of council by raising issues that about a decision that I may have felt wasn't in keeping with that example, quasi-judicial decision-making around planning. How do we get around that? It's a real issue. I hear the frustration from executive officers that are here today, but that's also shared by elected members. But we have some real hurdles that are almost impossible to overcome to correct the behaviour of elected members because of the impositions placed on us by legislation.
Yeah, and there are difficulties, and I don't want to downplay them. Essentially, this is an area of time and place, and the appropriate time and place. Adverse reflection is prohibited in many contexts. One of them, for example, is standing orders or meeting procedures when you have a council or committee meeting, and they may apply at briefings, for example. So that's a forum where it's open, particularly if it's open to the public, where reflecting adversely, particularly when it's on the character rather than the actions of a person, has significant ramifications. And that's why it's prohibited. If there's a concern about what someone has done or said, then there's often a better forum, a more appropriate forum to have that dealt with. And your liaison forums with the CEO are a very good, very useful one insofar as that if you're reviewing what's happened in the previous council meeting. So there's no bar about you saying what you like at that meeting with the CEO. I mean, within the bounds of respect and defamation and other things, but there's no prohibition against you adversely reflecting on the character or actions of someone. It's what the group is, where else you would say it. So I prefer to focus, I think, on some of these broader issues, and that's why I support, the broader code of conduct principles about, being respectful, treating each other with respect, and so on. That's the important they're the important fundamentals, rather than what does this term mean in law? And the next question often is, how can I get around it? Which is not the purpose. The purpose is to understand what the objective is and then follow the objective, which leads to the culture. Yeah.
Perhaps one last question, Neil, and then we'll let you get back to work and solve all the problems in the world. This is probably a question for Neil as much as a question for the sector to have a consideration of. A Dean from the Shire of Harvey, thank you for your questions. The Minister talked about in terms of looking at increasing resourcing for the department or for the next state budget. And the last time I checked with the department, I think there are about 35 people all up working in the Department of Local Government, Sports and Cultural Industry. 35 people that supports the entire sector. And that's the same team of people that looks after Act Review, puppy farming, Cats Act and Dogs Act and Caravan Park, and obviously all of the inquiry that's happening at the moment. If there isn't room to increase resourcing from within the department, do you think that there's capacity for local governments to collectively fund the department to allow for additional staffing, or would that be considered inappropriate?
Well, can I just preface that with Jamie's, one of Jamie's openings and the question to the Minister was about resourcing, and he put it fairly, even though bluntly, that everybody knows the department's under-resourced. Now, it's not doing the job that it should do. And the inquiry report gives it a heap of other things. There's pages of recommendations recommending in terms of training and follow-up about all these extra things the department has to do. Now, it's one thing, as I've done in the past, to make recommendations, but the recommendations need to be realistic, and you understand the Minister's dilemma. I mean, we're going through COVID, the state's got a massive debt, there may not be the resources there. So that's part of what needs to be managed, but for effective training and for effective follow-up and overseeing of local government, we'll continue to have these problems unless we put these measures in place. And you either spend millions on an inquiry every now and then, plus a lot more on these authorised person inquiries once the horse is bolted, or you try to fix it before the start. Now, I think there's a real issue. I haven't done the numbers, but economists out there would be able to say, well, is it actually worth the government transferring its funds from the back end to the front end and resourcing? Now, the idea of funding the department, that takes self-regulation. That's one of the aspirations of the report to a different level. I'm not sure how that would work. We've had industry-wide. It's an interesting idea that perhaps might be followed up, particularly in the Harvey area. But look, I appreciate this is not. It's not just saying, you know, the Rolls-Royce position would be, you know, what the reform review has recommended or the inquiry has recommended. We may need to come back from that. But there are, I think, these issues of efficiency and resourcing where enormous costs to the back end, and even as a lawyer I know generally, it's far more costly to try to fix a problem later, for example, going to court over something, than it is to get the rules right to start. And so investing in getting the rules right, getting training, even if it's not the Rolls-Royce training, get something far more adequate than we've got now, and getting an effective system for early intervention. I mean, I don't think it's any more expensive to have a standards panel reporting after 1 month rather than reporting after 12 months. They're still going to report. They're still going to get the volume of cases. So you need the right people there, and you need the standards to say, well, you know, we're not satisfied with sitting with you for 12 months. The whole idea of this is to have a quick determination. If you get it wrong, then go to SAT, that's fine, but this is all about achieving that objective. And I'm not sure that's a lot more expensive than what we're currently doing. In fact, it may be more expensive. It takes me longer to sit on something for a long period of time than to deal with it straight away. So maybe it's the efficiency of the expenditure of those resources rather than the total numbers.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your questions, and thank you very much, Neil. Please give him a round of applause. Neil, your insights were valuable as usual, and I think everyone here has got something to take away. We have a small thank you for you, which is a food bank donation, which is made on your behalf, which I'd just like to present to you. Thank you very much. And very sage words of Neil's, and whilst we certainly won't be, well, I don't think it's one of our advocacy statements to be funding the department to do whatever it can to progress some of the report recommendations. We're certainly committed to working with the department, and I know Walga is as well, where we can use our professionalism to be able to assist them in developing these tools and principles that are needed for the benefit of the sector. And we've already offered that assistance to the Minister following the inquiry report and also the panel report quite recently. So Gordon's here in the room, and you can take us up on any assistance that we can provide to you, Gordon. But I thank you all for your attendance, and apologies also to those people online whose questions we didn't get to today. I know that we could probably sit here for half the day talking to Neil and listening to his advice. But thank you all for your attendance, and we thank the Minister and Neil for the time that they have taken to prepare and present to us today. I think it's been really valuable, and I'm sure that everyone here has learned something and taken away something through shared experiences. If you found this particular topic really interesting, then you might also enjoy the Better Practice Forum, a session that we're holding in a few weeks' time on integrity and ethics in local government, which aligns nicely with today's session. And I believe Neil is talking at that one as well. So we've almost got him on the payroll. So thank you very much for everyone for your attendance today, and have a great day. Thank you.